You should have already watched the nationalism and nation-state video, and that provides you with the definitions and then a short explanation of these concepts. What we're going to take a look at right now are the terms for Section 2 and discussion of the content of Section 2 with regard to the revolutions that occur in Europe. So after the Congress of Vienna, we see a number of things occurring. We see the restoring of old monarchies and territorial divisions. We see the Latin American countries fighting for freedom along with countries in the Balkans region, which we'll talk about tonight. Within the countries, efforts for peace and stability are failing, and these revolutions erupt between 1815 and 1848. And we find three forces that are struggling for supremacy in European society: the conservatives, the liberals, and the radicals. So those concepts of life, liberty, and property are still being discussed, but to what degree will the reform take place? And that's where we see these divisions. What would be the perspective of a 19th century conservative living in Europe? A conservative wants the old regime. He wants the monarchy back. So conservatives, liberals, and radicals, here are your definitions. For conservatives, they're wealthy property owners, nobility. They want to protect the traditional monarchies of Europe. Liberals, middle-class business leaders and merchants, and they want to give more power to elected parliaments, but only parliaments in which the educated and landowners could vote. So we can see that people are being left out of this process. And lastly, radicals. They favored drastic change to extend democracy to the people as a whole. They believed government should practice the ideals of the French Revolution. And again, these are still revolutionary ideas even 30 years later. And of course, the struggle between these types of groups still exists today. The Concert of Europe is a system established by the Congress of Vienna. It's the principle of collective security, which was established as a result of the Congress. Their goal was to define and monitor the status quo, and we see the rise of a new era of conservative politics. If you remember, Metternich was a bit of a conservative, and he wanted to see Europe go back to its old stable ways under its monarchs. And again, in that concert of countries in Europe, there would be stability and order. So conservatism, let's try that again. Conservatism arose in reaction to liberalism and the violence unleashed by the French Revolution. Early conservatism was allied to the restored monarchies of Austria, Prussia, France, and England. Conservatives believed in order, society, and the state, faith, as well as the tradition that went with those. Support for conservatism came from the traditional ruling class and also was supported by the peasants. This was in reaction to the radicals of the revolution. So the peasants were on board too. By the 1830s, the return to the old order was breaking down. Liberals and nationalists were openly revolting against conservative governments. Liberal middle class, teachers, lawyers, and business people led the struggle for constitutional government and the formation of nation-states. So the independence movements in the Balkans kind of started the ball rolling in Europe, and you can see Greece is a part of the Balkans. The Balkans definition is the following: that it includes a region consisting of all or part of present-day Greece, number one, Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, Turkey, and the former Yugoslavia. The Greek Revolution occurred in 1821. This is a painting reflecting that. Lord Byron, he was known as a martyr in Greece. He was English. In fact, he was a British Romantic poet. He fought on the side of the Greeks and their quest for independence from the Ottoman Empire. And as you can see in the statement here, he compared the Greek nationalists to the ancient Spartans. And if you remember King Leonidas, which is in the picture to the left, King Leonidas led the Spartans in the 300, very famous ancient battle of inspiration. The Spartans were fierce warriors, and what Byron was doing was essentially comparing the nationalists of Greece to these ancient warriors. Greek independence. In 1827, the Battle of Navarino is where British, French, and Russian troops joined with the nationalists and destroyed the Ottoman Egyptian fleet. So the Ottoman Empire is desperately trying to retain their territories. Greece was among them, and were failing against the combined forces of Britain, France, Russia, and the nationalists. In 1829, the Treaty of Adrianople is written, and in 1830, Greece is declared an independent nation as a result of the Treaty of London. And in the revolutions that we're going to be talking about, there are revolutions in other places which are being circled. Well, France actually is circled, but we're going to take a look at France, as well as Russia, and of course, we have already looked at Greece. France's Restoration era is the era after the Congress of Vienna. This is the era of conservative rule. And France emerged from the chaos of its revolutionary period as the most liberal large state in Europe. So despite the fact that this was a conservative time of stability and order established by Metternich, we find that this king, who took his throne back, Louis XVIII, governed France as a constitutional monarch, so reforms were made. He agreed to limit his royal power. He granted legislative power to a parliament. He protected the civil rights of his people, and he upheld the Napoleonic Code. Following King Louis XVIII, we find King Charles X in 1830. This king was very different, though. He wanted to return to an absolute monarchy, and this sparked riots that forced him into exile. He was replaced by another king, Louis Philippe, who was a supporter of liberal reforms. So we find another king coming to power who will use liberal reforms. The problem is, he wasn't too great of a king, and he wasn't very well liked, as you can see by the uncomplimentary caricature of Louis Philippe on the left side. He was called the Citizen King, but was not popular among the French people. And there is another caricature of Louis, who is really called the Père. So there's a revolution. It's called the February Revolution. The working class and the liberals are unhappy with King Louis Philippe, and he loses control of Paris and abdicates his throne on February 24th. Alphonse Lamartine is the leader of the radicals who declared this new provisional government, but the government unfortunately began to fall apart almost immediately, and there was great violence in the streets, and therefore the French people turned to a more moderate government, much like what happened shortly after the death of Robespierre and the establishing of the Directory. This is the same idea. A more moderate government was called for after this provisional government. So we find a president elected. This new government calls for a parliament and a strong president, and it's called the Second French Republic. The president is Louis Napoleon, who is called the Law and Order candidate. He is a nephew of Napoleon, and he's elected. Again, the French people were weary of the instability that the radicals had provided in their provisional government, and they welcomed this strong ruler to bring peace to France. He calls himself Emperor in 1851, Emperor Napoleon III. Louis Napoleon built railroads, he encouraged industrialization, and promoted an ambitious public works program. Because of his policies, unemployment decreased in France and the country experienced real prosperity. So we see him looking quite like a king, doesn't he? The Russian Revolution of 1825. The Russian upper class had come into contact with Western liberal ideas during the Napoleonic Wars. And in late November of 1825, Russian Tsar Alexander I died suddenly, and that's his picture in the top left-hand corner. Nicholas comes to power, and he's named by Alexander I as heir before his death. The Russian troops were to take an oath of allegiance to Nicholas, who was not very popular due to his beliefs about being absolute in his power, with no other say in government provided to the people. So there's an uprising in St. Petersburg in 1825 where we find the Moscow regiment. These soldiers marched into the Senate Square in St. Petersburg and refused to take the oath. The revolt is crushed. Nicholas ordered the cavalry and artillery to attack the insurgents. Insurgents are basically rebels. Over 60 were killed of these soldiers. 5 plotters were executed. Over 100 insurgents were exiled to Siberia. So this revolt is put down almost immediately. The results, though, of this Russian rebellion, it was the first rebellion in modern Russian history where the rebels had specific political goals. The rebels came to symbolize the dreams and ideals of all Russian liberals. Nicholas was determined that his power would never again come into question, so he becomes even more of a harsh leader. His successor, Alexander II, made reforms to create social change and help modernize Russia after a loss in the Crimean War. So here we see a map of Europe in 1830. You can see the German Confederation as well as Russia and France. Greece down there as part of the Ottoman Empire, but Greece establishes its independence, so that's why it's named separately. The results of these revolutions. These revolutions were successful only in Western Europe. Their success was in their popular support. The middle class led, aided by the urban lower classes. The successful revolutions had benefited the middle class. The workers were left empty-handed. Therefore, these revolutions leave much unfinished business and a definitely angry, frustrated, unsatisfied working class. So that's the end of the notes for revolutions disrupting Europe. You should have notes for both France, Russia, and Greece. And then, of course, the terms, you should have those defined as well. And we'll answer any questions that you may have tomorrow.